Morning, everybody.
This is what. Wait. Don't forget your magic word. I lost it. Okay, whatever. Go to your groups. It's there, Jackie. Not sure. That's what mine's doing.
Because that's not the one.
Oh, I'll just.
All right, we'll wait a few more moments and then we'll get started. Let everybody log in. Hi, Grady and Layton. Mommy.
I'm so sorry. I apologize.
It's okay.
I turned it off. Okay. Thank you for coming again.
All right. One more minute and we will get started.
I keep losing it. Okay, well, I don't know how to help you.
How's everybody today? We're good? Another day, same old, inside the house. Hi, Miss Annette. We're sending you hugs from inside the quilt store. And the same to Miss Joanne. We're sending you hugs as well. We're sorry that you have to be home in this time alone. So just know that we're thinking of you. All right, so we're gonna get started. And today I'm gonna cover a couple of different techniques for quilt as you go. So we're going to talk a little bit about quilt as you go with no backing on the quilt as you go through the backing as well. So we had to have two options for quilt as you go, and we're going to cover both of them. So just remember that if you're going to take notes or something, this will be recorded. It'll stay up in the group. It's not going to go anywhere, so you can go back and watch at any time for this particular information. So again, if you're motion sick, just close your eyes while I tilt the camera here. Maybe. Okay, I think we have a good clean shot at the moment here. So laying here, we'll come back to these in a little bit, but yes, these were machine embroidered quilted, but they were done as quilt as you go. So we'll come back and talk about these in a few moments, and I'll explain them as well. So we're gonna talk first about quilting with the through the backing and everything. So that when you're done, you're done. So the first technique, I just have some scrappy sample pieces together here for us to look at. So the stripe piece here is, pretend this is your quilt block, okay? And the navy blue or royal blue is backing fabric. just so that you can see. So this is a technique that we use. It's called using a coving strip. It's C-O-V-I-N-G. And basically you would take your quilt block, you would sandwich it with batting, quilt it however you would like, trim it all up nice and even, and you would do that with each block across the quilt. So this type of quilting as you go allows you to be able to quilt something much smaller versus a big giant quilt all at once trying to get under it. Helps you learn some techniques or practice, because again, you're only working with a small block versus a giant quilt. So once you get all your blocks done, what you do is you're going to put them right sides together, and we're going to take a piece of fabric that we call the coving strip. So it's kind of like binding per se. Now if I was going to, I'll talk about what size this is in a moment, but I'm going to take a piece of fabric, fold it in half. We're going to put it raw edges even with the edge of the block, and we're going to sew 1/4 of an inch. Okay. This will allow you that once you open that 2 blocks sewn together, you'll be able to take this unit, fold it over, and you can hand sew it shut or machine sew it shut. And I will talk about, I would use thread to match. A lot of people use invisible thread. On the back of a quilt, I would use just thread to match. You know, it's a little tiny stitch down the front. Most people don't notice it, but it is there. I would do this by hand, you know, a little bit more handwork. If I was going to do this by hand, this strip is cut 1.5 inches and then folded. And if I was going to do it by machine, I would cut a 2-inch strip and fold it in half. Okay? And so by folding that over, that then allows us to encase that raw edge that we have in the back and move on. So you would continue to do that with each block in the row, and then when you were going to join the rows together, you would do just like you did here, except it's going to be a much longer piece of coving strip. I hope that makes sense. So if you have questions, please throw them into the comment box, and I will come back to answering questions, or as I see them kind of pop up, I will I will try to answer them as I see them. So that's type number 1, okay? Now, the next type would be to use a sashing strip to cover this raw edge. So this is the back of my quilt. Again, I've quilted each block individually, trimmed them all up, sewed them together, except this time when I sewed them together, backing together, 1/4 of an inch seam, okay? And then on the front, I would take this seam and press open, okay? Now, a little tip, once you start doing this, and it works even with just cotton fabric, if you've got a section or a seam that doesn't want to lay flat when you press it, because maybe you've got a lot of seams coming together or batting is in here, I'm not a huge person that uses steam, so I like to iron really well, get it nice and hot, and then I use a product called a clapper. So basically it's a piece of wood. We used it in garment sewing industry to get nice creases and pleats and stuff. And so you get this nice and hot with the iron, and then you set that on top of it while it cools. This allows the fabric to cool in the position that you want it to cool in and not want to naturally come back up and together. So this helps when you are pressing maybe some thicker seams. So you just kind of set that there, and then you'd move on to the next seam and then lift up and move over. It doesn't need to sit there long, but it does help to get these seams nice and flat for that. When you're using this technique, the sashing strip, we would then take a sashing strip. Basically, it's a piece of fabric that we have folded the raw edges into the middle, that we would then place on top of our block and then top stitch down both edges to hold that down. And then that allows you to have a backing that looks like a normal backing, no hand sewing required, and then you could have kind of the general look of a sashing strip. So, and it doesn't have to be like for mine, we have, this is obviously very different. A lot of times this can be done with techniques just to make it look like a quilt sashing. It can be, let me see if I can find some project pictures here. Okay. So it can be incorporated into the design versus being something completely different and kind of stands out. So like all of those, the green and blue that you see here are basically that type of strip that is covering up a seam allowance in the quilt. They can be, nothing says they have to be straight. Any way that you sew the block together, you could do it with this technique. So that is another technique. There is product, just for, we all have bias tape makers and things like that that are designed for this. Miss Pauline is from Australia, and she actually has developed these products. They're called Sashers. They come in a bunch of sizes, but including the one that we've used for the jelly roll rug, she makes one. But they're just there to help you be able to kind of feed in your fabric. Let me get it in here. And then as you're ironing, it just kind of keeps it folded over as you're ironing. So it's just kind of a nice third hand. Keep your fingers out of the way when you are pressing with the hot iron, and then that type of thing. Kind of also helps you keep consistent. So that is just something that's out there. If you get into doing quilt as you go technique with this sashing strip, these sashers can be helpful, especially when you get down to wanting to do 1/4 inch sashings. So basically you're starting out with a 1/2 inch strip that you're then folding into the middle. I mean, so you're talking like itty bitty tiny folding. So I think I'd probably lose a little bit of skin on my fingers and my fingerprints if I was trying to do a lot of that. Okay, so they come in a bunch of sizes. So that's how you would finish this one with that sashing strip. Okay, could be incorporated into the design that you were laying your quilt out in. The other way is to make your backing larger than your quilt, than your blocks, because we're going to use the backing as our sashing. So the backing fabric is cut 2 inches larger than your block. You'd place your block down, you do your quilting, and then make sure that this is 2 inches, an inch basically all the way around, larger than your quilt, your finished quilt block. What you're going to do is you take and put the blocks back sides together. You would sew this 1 inch seam. So you're basically sewing right down next to the quilt block. Okay. And then when you open them up, you're going to fold the seam into the middle, and then raw edge of this seam into the middle, and then fold in half and press. And then you top stitch down both edges of that sashing strip, or binding strip, you can kind of call it. So this is another technique. Again, gives you the appearance of a built-in sashing, provided that you were using fabric that was the same color. But this was just what I could find in the boxes last night and create for you guys. So this one is a lot of fun as well. Again, completely done by machine. If you quilted top stitched in the same color as your backing fabric, you can't even see it. It just becomes part of the quilting that's in the background on the back of the quilt. So this quilt here was done like the first sample that I showed you with the coving strip. Okay, so the only difference is that there was a sashing strip on the front and a coving strip on the back. So there was one on each side of the quilt, and so that when we joined them together, they covered up and filled in the gap. And then I stitched it from the front of the quilt with a little running stitch. This was stitch number 4 on a Bernina, with the width and length increased to give me like this little running stitch. And by doing that, it also stitched it down the back as well. So this quilt, these were each individually embroidered blocks that were quilted in the hoop with the backing that was then sewn together using the coving strip example. Okay. Now, that is the one option that puts your backing fabric on it, and then you're going to quilt it and then sew it together and cover up a seam. Let's talk about if you didn't want to put your backing fabric on and you wanted to quilt through batting. Okay. Batting, you're going to cut larger than the block that you were going to use. So if you were going to create a 10-inch block, I would probably use a good 12-inch square batting. Preferably cotton batting and not polyester, or something that's like 80-20, like 80% cotton, because you are going to do ironing on top of this. And irons and polyester batting don't get along, especially if they're hot and steamy, because that batting will start to melt, kind of flattens. It doesn't melt per se, but it just flattens out. So there's a couple of ways that we can do this method with just quilting through the batting. You can actually piece right into the batting. So we would take a piece, our center square, put it in the middle, put right sides together, so 1/4 of an inch, and then flip out. And then 1/4 of an inch and flip out. Now you can also, as you add pieces, you could quilt each individual piece that you put on there, or quilt a row. Once this row was on, then I would probably take this piece of fabric, sew it across the top, and go up. If you wanted a 9 patch, you could piece this 9 patch on the sewing machine and then attach it to here in one piece. So you could piece your rows of your block and then assemble them onto a batting square. Hopefully that makes sense. And then you could quilt this particular block. Now, once your blocks were finished quilting, and this is also a really good technique for using up scraps. You can do what we call string quilts, or any quilt that uses fabric foundation or anything like that. And you could just lay your strip across and then do what we call stitch and flip across each block, each square batting, and then trim this square down. Okay. Now, once your block is finished piecing and quilted, you would then trim it up to the size block that you were going to go for. So we're going to say this was going to be a 9.5 inch square. Okay. So I have my 9.5 inch square that I've done trimmed all up. I'm going to take my other 9.5 inch squares in my row. I'm going to put them right sides together. I'm going to sew 1/4 of an inch seam. So in all of these techniques, you're going to be either using your dual feed on your current line Berninas or a walking foot. This is not something that you want to be doing with a standard presser foot because of thickness, because at this point here we've got 2 layers of batting and 2 layers of cotton, so you definitely want a walking foot on. We're going to sew 1/4 inch, okay, and then we will again open this up and press this seam flat. And you would do this all the way across the row of the quilt. And then when you were ready to sew rows together, we would do the same thing, right sides together, sew 1/4 inch. Now, it's going to get really bulky right here where you've got layers of batting and seam allowances and everything coming together. So once you've got your rows assembled, you're going to take and trim your seam allowance kind of at an angle. So we're working on getting the batting mostly out of that extra layer of batting out of this seam allowance so that this is not quite as bulky when we go to press this seam open. Okay. Once all of your rows together and your blocks are together and your rows are together, then you would put a backing fabric. One big giant piece of backing fabric, pin it in place, and then you stitch in the ditch. Okay, so you would just stitch your rows and stitch your blocks, and you know, all your beautiful elaborate quilting is on the front of the quilt, and it's just basic quilting on the back because everybody's going to look at the front. They don't really look and flip over to the back of the quilt. So you would just stitch in the ditch this type of quilt. So, for example, that's this quilt. Okay. In this quilt, these blocks were, again, machine embroidered and quilted. Okay. I do not claim to be able to do this type of quilting on my own. And I'm not ashamed to admit that I used an embroidery machine for it. So these blocks were 5-inch squares, okay? I sewed them together in that same manner until my entire my quilt top was together. And then I added my backing to my quilt and I stitched in the ditch, okay? And so that gives you all of the beautiful work is on the front. And for me, this was going to be is a wall hanging. So it's going to hang on a wall. The wall doesn't care if there's not quilting on the back of this particular project. So we have the beautiful look on the front, and I didn't have to deal with the bulk or do all the hand stitching of a coving strip or anything along that line. And then once you've quilted and put your backing on and stitched in the ditch, then you can bind in whatever manner you like. Sewing machine, hand, it's your choice. Okay? Now, that's all fine and dandy, provided you haven't put the rows together or you still have some pieces to be done. I don't have an example. I'm not a miracle worker and could not get one piece last night. So this picture shows you an on-point quilt where you quilt in sections. Okay? So I would quilt this unit and quilt this section and then quilt this section. This is only the blocks and batting. Okay? So the final assembly will be this type of assembly and then putting a backing on and stitching in the ditch. So this could be a queen size quilt, and you will probably be more comfortable quilting, you know, something a little at this size versus trying to do all of this big giant quilt at once. So, does that make sense? I hope so. After your quilt top is together, you may be thinking, well, I want to put borders on this. And how do I do that? So putting borders on a quilt as you go quilt is very much the same way. You would take your quilt. Okay. So I have my quilt. This one has backing on it right this second, but it can be done without backing as well. Take your quilt, take your border, lay it right sides together with your quilt, put a piece of batting down, sew your 1/4 inch, and then flip it up and flip your border out, and then you quilt this border. Okay? This can be done with or without backing on it. So you could easily put backing on this quilt, stitch in the ditch, and then attach borders. And that's done in the same way. We would just put the front border right sides together, our backing fabric right sides together with the back of our quilt, our piece of batting, and sew 1/4 inch, and then flip everything up so that we have basically attaching a border, and then you're just dealing with quilting this section of the borders versus, because all of this is now secured already in place, and you're only worrying about this section here. Okay? So that's another way to put a border up, to add a border to a quilt. So I have a couple of things. These are some reference books that we have. Now, I don't have a ton of this because, again, I did not plan for us to all be trapped at home, and I am now talking about and trying to teach you things via the internet. So this is just a couple of books that I will be getting in if you are interested in them. I'm still receiving deliveries. Everybody is still shipping, and so they will be here shortly. This is the book from Miss Pauline that uses the sasher strips and sashers. This Machine Quilting in Sections book by Marty Michelle talks a lot about this technique, as well as this technique of putting on borders and sections. She calls it a 6-layer seam. And then the bottom two books are both by the same author that cover this style of technique and additional information as well. There's patterns and stuff in there for different quilts. But there's lots of information in Pinterest and Google and YouTube and Facebook, all on Quilt As You Go. Do I have any questions? Let me get up here so that you can see me, because I'm tired of looking down. I really prefer to see your faces, but that's okay. One day we'll get there. All right. Sorry. I'm not used to this technology quite yet. Do I have any questions? Everybody's so quiet. Is everybody awake? I didn't put anybody to sleep, did I?
Yeah, I'll have to do some research. Let me call you back, okay?
Our 10 Sisters books arrived today. So books came yesterday. I'm hoping Grid arrives today. So that was quick, coming from Utah. So as soon as Grid gets here, we will be getting all that together for everybody and getting stuff in the mail for you that have been waiting patiently for it to arrive. For my Spree Club members, your April Spree Club has arrived and is here, safe in my possession. So it will be here for you when you're ready for it. Let's see, what else? I don't know if I have much else for today. Oh, I do have another gift bag to give away. So make sure that you like the video and comment on it, and I will do another drawing, pick another random winner. Let's see, today, let me stop saying Today's Tuesday, so we will go with Wednesday evening. I will draw another winner for another goodie bag, which I left in the classroom at the moment. I do have plans to do another Facebook Live tomorrow. So we'll do one tomorrow. I think I'm going to talk about thread, a little bit about thread education. We're going to cover all about different weights of thread, the way that the different ways thread's put on spools, and some other additional information about that. Because what else do you want to hear about? I'm just grasping at straws here for you guys. So, all right, it looks like everybody's good to go here. Let me just make sure. Well, I hope you enjoyed that little bit of information about Quilt as you go, so maybe it'll help you finish quilting some of those projects that you are finishing up piecing over the last few weeks. So I hope that you enjoyed this and that you stay safe, and we will be back here soon. Thanks and have a great day.